They said Horace Denbury died alone on a woodland path. His silver watch stopped at 4:17, and his cane snapped like a bone. But in the quiet village of St. Anselm's Hollow, where even a late bakery cart can signal unrest, Miss Marple knew better. For when a man known for punctual walks and spotless records suddenly changes his habits, it's not the ticking of time that's suspicious. It's what finally made him stop. Two alibis would soon emerge to defend the same man. But in a village where silence speaks louder than confessions, Miss Marple would uncover that some truths don't come out in court. They unravel in whispers, cracked teacups, and the careful rearrangement of guilt. And behind it all, a secret so old, it had already begun to rot beneath a polished grave. The morning had unfolded with the mild patience of early May in St. Anselm's Hollow. Sunlight, the color of churned cream, lay lazily across hedgerows and the edges of stone walls. In the garden behind the whitewashed cottage on Old Mill Lane, Miss Marple leaned over her rose bed, inspecting a troubling sign of black spot on her Queen of Sweden. Gardening, as she often remarked, was not dissimilar to human nature, seemingly lovely, but requiring constant attention and no little understanding of silent suffering. A thrush was singing somewhere near the hedge, and the clock in the hallway had just struck 9. The sound, muffled by linen curtains, drew no remark from the cottage's sole occupant. For Miss Marple's mind, while tenderly occupied with rose canes, was also attuned, as always, to the rhythm of the village itself. The baker's cart had passed earlier than usual, and young Elsie Moore, who worked at the chemist's, had gone by twice in 1 hour. That to Miss Marple was rather more telling than the weather forecast. It was just as she was returning her secrets to their drawer in the potting shed that she heard it, a sharp voice cracked by distance, crying out along the lane near the quarry path. Then silence, the kind of silence, as Miss Marple would later reflect, that feels like someone holding their breath. By the time she had made her way back to the side gate, Mrs. Wetherby had already appeared by the post box, hand to chest, with that expression peculiar to village ladies torn between shock and the irresistible thrill of proximity to scandal. "It's Mr. Denbury," she said breathlessly. "Horace Denbury, found just now near the quarry, lying all stiff." The young Barker lad ran down to fetch the constable. Miss Marple said nothing at first. She looked instead at the narrow path which ran down from the woods, shrouded in pale hawthorn blossoms. "Oh dear," she murmured with a note not of surprise, but of acknowledgment. "That is rather strange." By noon, half the village had been informed with varying degrees of accuracy. At the foot of the path where Horace Denbury had been found, voices rose and fell in careful tones, respectful but full of questions. Denbury, as most agreed, was not the sort of man one expected to find, lying at odd angles on woodland trails. A retired solicitor of 30 years, he had lived alone in Orchard View for nearly 2 decades, and apart from his unwavering attendance at the Thursday chess circle, and his habitual walk at precisely 4 o'clock each afternoon, he kept largely to himself. But lately, murmured Mr. Pilcher, who managed the grocer accounts, he'd been walking later. "Just this past week, I saw him pass by near 5. Others nodded. Change in someone like Denbury was not merely noted. It was registered with deep unease. For a man who had always carried his cane with the tip precisely 3 in ahead of his left boot, a deviation of time suggested something had shifted, something perhaps not visible at all. Constable Burley stood at the edge of the scene, with the detached look of a man performing a duty whose seriousness had not yet fully announced itself. The village doctor, summoned in haste, was crouched beside the body. "No bruising of the temple," he said quietly, "and no bleeding to speak of. His cane is broken clean through, though." Odd angle that Miss Marple had approached no closer than the second stile, but her eyes followed every movement with the kind of attention that many mistook for frailty. The doctor held up a silver watch. "Stopped at 417. Could be coincidence, of course. Or not." Burley scratched behind his ear. "No sign of anyone else. Robbery. His wallet's there. Nothing missing as far as I can tell." The doctor replaced the watch carefully, then stood. "He might have fallen, but it doesn't quite sit right." Miss Marple, unseen beneath her soft straw hat, narrowed her eyes. "No, it doesn't," she said. "Not to anyone in particular. Later that afternoon, the conversation at the bakery turned to the matter of Denbury's character, as it always does in such villages where death is still greeted with memory before morning. Miss Marple, sipping weak tea in the parlor, let her mind linger on a remark she had heard only last week. Denbury had spoken at the library committee, something dismissive about loose ends and people who let things dangle untidily. He had said it, as he said most things, with clipped precision and the faintest sneer, his eyes never quite meeting those of the person he was addressing. Now that phrase drifted back to her, incongruous yet oddly present, loose ends. It struck her that people who disdain disorder often fear it, perhaps because they have glimpsed it close to home, or in some cases within themselves. She folded her knitting and laid it aside. Outside, the wind rustled the lilacs. There were, she thought, too many tidy things left unsaid about Mr. Denbury. In the days that followed, villagers noted again and again the deviation in Denver's final walk. Not at 4, but near 5. Not his usual westward route, but down through the quarry path. No one could say precisely when the change had begun. That in itself was telling. In a village as attentive as St. Anselm's Hollow, true mysteries often lay not in what was seen, but in what had been overlooked for just a few quiet days. Miss Marple, pausing beside her now silent Rose bed, considered the matter. She had long ago learned that people rarely step away from habit without a reason, unless, of course, they are trying very hard to leave something behind. The garden of the vicarage, ringed with rhododendron in early bloom, hosted the annual charity tea that Friday afternoon. The vicar's wife, ever diligent in her floral frocks and finger sandwiches, kept a cheerful eye on the cucumber plate, while pretending not to overhear every conversation beneath the old sycamore. Miss Marple sat quietly with her needlework, her expression pleasantly detached, though her ears, as always, took their measure of each tone and hesitation. For while the event was nominally in aid of the roof repairs for St. Mildred's, it had become, by unspoken agreement, a gathering point for piecing together the unsettled matter of Mr. Denbury's death. "I still say it was his heart," whispered Mrs. Ridgewell to her companion, lifting her teacup without spilling. "You know what pride does to a man in his 60s. He wouldn't see a doctor even if he were gasping. And yet," murmured Miss Hartnell from the sewing stall, "he never missed a step on that walk. Never once." Her voice carried that curious weight common to those who find comfort in casting shadows. By the trestle table, where Mrs. Maggs presided over jars of rhubarb chutney, conversation had turned, as it must, to the new tenant at Weaver's cottage. Mr. Daniel Bryce, a former army man, had moved in just 3 months past. Quiet, courteous, always in a tweed jacket regardless of weather, and possessed of that particular shyness which draws interest rather than deflects it. "I dare say he's not been right since the war," offered Mr. Wilds, leaning in with the tone of one, imparting a thoughtful charity. "Keeps to himself, but they say he talks in his sleep." "Does he?" Miss Marple asked mildly, inspecting a pot of gooseberry preserve. "That's often more revealing than when one is wide awake. Horace Denbury didn't like him. That much is plain," said Mrs. Maggs. "Said he was keeping hens without proper fencing, but I think there was more to it. He didn't trust the man." Miss Marple did not answer at once. Her gaze wandered across the garden to where Mr. Bryce himself sat alone on a bench, politely declining a second scone. It was not distrust she saw in the man's posture. It was weariness, the kind not born of guilt, but of having too often been the subject of whispered judgments. As the crowd thinned, Miss Marple found herself near Mrs. Parsons, the Long Irving cleaner at the church and part-time attendant at the post office. Mrs. Parsons, who rarely saw conversation but rarely missed a detail either, was sipping elderflower cordial with a furrowed brow. "Funny thing," she said more to herself than to Miss Marple. "I saw Mr. Denbury outside the post office not 3 days ago, mid-morning arguing with someone." Miss Marple's knitting paused. "Arguing Mrs. Parsons?" "Well, talking sharply at any rate. Red in the face he was. And the other person just stood there, didn't raise a voice, just took it." "Did you recognize the other person?" Mrs. Parsons hesitated, then shook her head. "It might have been Mr. Bryce. Had the same jacket, but then I couldn't be sure. He turned just as I was crossing, and well, it could have been anyone really." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, but only slightly. Sometimes, she said gently, we remember more than we believe we do, especially if we weren't supposed to be noticing at all. By Monday morning, more concrete statements began to filter in. Daniel Bryce, when approached discreetly by Constable Burley, had supplied an alibi. He had spent the late afternoon at the Black Bull Inn, engaged in a quiet game of cards with Mr. Treadgold and 2 other patrons. The landlord confirmed the gathering, though the timing was imprecise. Simultaneously, Lavinia Denbury, cousin to the late Horace, and now staying at Orchard View in the days following his death, made her own statement. She claimed to have seen her cousin speaking to someone, a man in a coat very like Daniel's, near the footbridge that led to the wooded lane. The sighting, she said, occurred at a little after 4. She had not drawn close. She explained out of a wish to avoid intruding. Miss Marple, upon hearing this from the vicer's wife, made a soft humming sound and resumed her mending. 2 alibis, one spoken, one observed, both supporting Bryce's innocence. And yet, she reflected, they aligned rather too easily. Most people are not so helpful to others, without reason or guilt or fear. And what was even more interesting, she thought, was not what these alibis claimed, but what they had so carefully omitted. As the conversation continued, Lavinia was overheard again, this time at the grocer's, clarifying her earlier sighting. It was definitely a brown coat, she said with calm assurance. And tall, taller than Horace. He seemed agitated, though the other man said nothing, just stood there. Mrs. Preet, who had been selecting tins of condensed milk, repeated the story to Miss Marple that same afternoon with predictable embellishments. Miss Marple simply nodded, but she felt a subtle tension pulling across the layers of the account. Clothing, particularly among men of similar age and generation, often bore resemblance. A brown coat, a tall man, an impression. But impressions, she knew, were notoriously vulnerable to suggestion, particularly when they helped form a narrative that kept more painful truths at bay. The hour, too, was indistinct, a little after 4. But no one in the village kept the same clocks, and Miss Marple had long ago learned that recollection often arrived wearing the garments of reassurance rather than reality. By midweek, the village seemed to have settled on its own quiet consensus. Daniel Bryce was to be viewed with caution, not accused, of course, for that would be indelicate, but regarded with the same wary politeness reserved for those touched by tragedy or misfortune. Miss Marple in her parlor that evening folded a fresh napkin over her tea tray and sat in thoughtful silence. She recalled, not for the first time, how often villagers claimed to know something they had, in fact only heard. A glance becomes a certainty. Her supposition, her recollection, her kindness offered becomes a motive, and silence becomes its own form of guilt. Truth, she reflected, was rather like embroidery. Every stitch must go precisely where it belongs, or the whole pattern shifts without notice. And in this particular canvas, too many threads had been drawn in haste, and in the same convenient direction. She sipped her tea, soft in thought. Something she knew had not yet been spoken. But in a place like St. Anselm's Hollow, truth never stays buried for long. It was late afternoon when Miss Marple appeared at the modest gate of Weaver's cottage, a neat parcel of knitting wool tucked under her arm. The gesture, she explained to herself and later to others, was entirely natural. Mr. Bryce had once mentioned a mother who crocheted, and Miss Marple had far more skins of fine merino than she strictly required. Daniel Bryce answered the door with his usual gentle reserve. He was a tall man, but there was something slightly stooped about the way he carried himself, as though forever folding inward. He invited her in with soft-spoken politeness and offered tea without insistence. The sitting room was clean, sparse, and somewhat impersonal. A rug worn at the edges, 2 armchairs, a side table with neatly aligned books. Miss Marple noticed these things without appearing to notice them, and commented instead on the quality of the light through the cottage's narrow windows. "I find wool knits truer in natural light," she said, "though it rarely reveals what we want to see, does it?" Bryce smiled faintly and nodded. "No, Miss Marple, but perhaps it shows what needs to be seen." A thoughtful reply, she considered. Too thoughtful for a man who claimed to forget appointments and misplaced letters. As she stirred her tea, Miss Marple allowed her eyes to linger gently on the mantel. There were 2 photographs placed at even intervals. One was faded with age, an army portrait, the young man in uniform, bearing Daniel's eyes, but a narrower jaw. The other was newer, a more informal likeness, yet the frame bore dust at its edges, as though untouched in years. "Your brother?" she asked quietly, nodding to the older of the 2. "Yes," said Bryce almost inaudibly. "John, we served together. He didn't come back." Miss Marple said nothing. After a moment, she lifted her gaze to the second photograph. "And the other?" Bryce hesitated. "A friend," he said simply. "From the field hospital. He was never quite the same after we were moved, but a kind soul." Not everyone understood that. Miss Marple nodded gently, sipping her tea. She did not ask further. Grief, when genuine, did not require prompting to be felt. But it was curious, she thought, how a man of modest means gave pride of place to memories he never spoke of, and how silence more than words filled the room. As they sat, Miss Marple inquired gently about the garden. More precisely, the hens kept just beyond the rear hedge, whose rustling and clucking reached them faintly through the open sash. "I imagine your neighbors enjoy the fresh eggs," she remarked with a smile. Bryce chuckled, though it held little mirth. Mr. Denbury did not. He thought them undignified, called it small-holding pretense. "I had a proper fence installed, but it didn't satisfy him." Miss Marple nodded. "He had opinions, I recall. Sharp ones, too. He threatened to write to my landlord." Bryce added, still looking into his cup. "Said it disturbed the tone of the property." I think he paused. "I think he liked rules more than people." Miss Marple placed her cup gently on the saucer. "Rules can be a comfort, especially when life has offered chaos." He looked at her then briefly. "And when they no longer comfort?" She met his gaze kindly. "Then some find a new rule to follow, others find someone to blame." Bryce smiled faintly but did not answer. The tea cooled on the tray between them. Later that same day, Miss Marple visited Orchard View, where Lavinia Denbury was staying in the days following her cousin's death. The parlor was overperfumed and overly still. Lavinia received her with gracious formality, pouring tea into thin china cups and asking after the roses in Miss Marple's garden. It was not long before the conversation, delicately steered, turned to family matters. Lavinia, perhaps mistaking Miss Marple's gentle manner for harmless curiosity, began to speak of Horace's sister, Ella Laner. She was a fragile creature, Lavinia said, far too kind-hearted. She never quite recovered after her husband died in the influenza. And Horace, well, he took on everything, the finances, the arrangements. There was a time, of course, when they were close. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. And after, Lavinia pursed her lips. After she revised her will rather suddenly. It favored Horace almost entirely. Her son, my cousin Philip, received nothing. Quite the scandal at the time, though no one dared say it aloud. Horace said she'd come to her senses. I often think, Miss Marple murmured, that a person's sense is most visible in the things they leave behind. Don't you agree? Lavinia did not reply. She was looking out of the window. The days following Eleanor's death, Lavinia admitted, were not what one would call harmonious. Philip had left for Canada within the year. Letters had gone unanswered. Horace, now sole master of the estate, had ceased referring to his sister entirely, as though she were no more than a legal inconvenience. I suppose it was easier that way, Lavinia said, to forget. And yet he kept the house, Miss Marple said mildly, and kept her portrait in the study. That does not quite speak of forgetfulness. Lavinia's hands twitched over her skirt. He did change after her death. Grew more rigid, more judgmental. Everything had to be tidy. Papers, accounts, even people. If someone didn't quite fit, they were simply moved aside. Miss Marple tilted her head. Including family. Lavinia gave a thin smile. Especially family. There was a silence that followed, the kind that does not rest between people, but within them. Miss Marple drank the last of her tea and rose. The air in the parlor felt brittle, as though something unspoken hung behind the curtains. As she walked home beneath the soft light of the afternoon, Miss Marple considered the threads now woven before her. A soldier whose wounds were not all visible, a cousin who had grown colder with power, a woman forgotten, except where her absence enriched another. Pain, MissMarple knew, rarely came roaring into parlors or shouting down village lanes. It dressed itself in modest skirts, wore gloves to service, and served tea with the best china. But it leaked into photographs untouched, into garden paths avoided, into the quiet tremor of a voice, remembering things it would rather forget. She passed by the churchyard and paused before the Denbury family plot. Ella stone was clean and freshly brushed, though it had been neglected for years. MissMarple bent slightly, brushing a leaf aside. "Someone remembers," she said softly, "even if they pretend not to." A robin chirped from the hedgerow. The village, outwardly unchanged, whispered its secrets only to those patient enough to listen beneath its careful silences. MissMarple, on the pretext of collecting a small parcel of embroidery thread, stepped into the post office at the usual hour. Mrs. Hensley, the postmistress, was rearranging stamps in their slotted drawer and greeted her with the air of someone who had been waiting to speak all morning. "I shouldn't say anything," she began, which in village parliament was a sure sign that she most certainly would. But Mr. Denbury sent a registered letter the day before he passed to a firm of solicitors in London, Hargrave, Bloom, and Dench. "Know them?" MissMarple gave a quiet shake of the head, though the name sounded vaguely familiar. "Did he seem agitated?" "Peculiar, I'd say nervous, kept smooth in the envelope, as if it were a speech he was practicing." MissMarple murmured something about the strain of legal matters, then stepped outside just in time to see Lavinia Denbury exiting the greengrocer's. She greeted her kindly, mentioning without weight that she'd just come from the post office. Lavinia's face stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Oh," she said, "not much happens there these days, I should think." MissMarple noted the pink flush rising along the edge of her cousin's collarbone, and how she looked past her, not at her. "Still," MissMarple replied gently, "it's where important things sometimes begin." That afternoon, MissMarple walked through the churchyard, ostensibly to check on a friend's camellia bush planted in memoriam beneath the southern window. Her route, however, meandered near the Denbury family plot. Ella Denbury's stone stood modestly, white-veined marble darkened by years of indifference. And yet now the lettering was newly visible, the moss scrubbed away with recent effort. Someone had polished the granite. Even the violets beside the base had been trimmed. MissMarple knelt, brushing away a fallen petal. She remembered the years when the grave had been neglected. Lavinia had mentioned it herself, and no one had been seen tending it until now. A man determined to forget would not scrub away moss. A woman who spoke of forgetting would not arrange violets with such care. MissMarple straightened slowly. The grave, she thought, had not been remembered out of love. Not quite. This was something else. Atonement, perhaps, or an anxious conscience trying to be tidy before time ran out. She paused, then murmured aloud, "It is remarkable how the dead can re-enter the lives of the living when we least expect it." The next morning brought with it a visit to the vicarage, ostensibly to deliver a jar of quingelly, but also to return a devotional pamphlet lent some weeks ago. The vicar's wife, always a willing conversationalist, welcomed MissMarple with tea and soft-cooked biscuits that crumbled under the slightest touch. "I've been meaning to tell you," she said, lowering her voice as if the tea tray itself might take offense. "The parish received a most generous donation last week, enough to cover the west window repairs and part of the bell tower." "How wonderful," MissMarple said, sipping delicately. "May I ask from whom?" "That's the odd part. It was anonymous. Sent through Hargrave, Bloom, and Dench in London, marked strictly private. But there was a notation for the restoration of what has long been neglected." MissMarple placed her cup gently back in the saucer. "That's a curious turn of phrase." Indeed, the vicar thought it poetic, but I dare say, odd, coming from a legal firm. "I've no doubt it was Mr. Denbury." MissMarple nodded slowly. Mr. Denbury had always made a point of being known, acknowledged. Even his smallest offerings were accompanied by crisp notes and proper public mention. To give silently, especially for something as sentimental as restoration, it didn't fit, unless of course the gift was not an offering at all, but a reckoning. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple passed Lavinia once more on the lane by the mill pond. They exchanged polite greetings, and Miss Marple remarked on the fine condition of Ellalinina Denbury's headstone. "It's been so long neglected," she said with mild regret, "but someone's taken the trouble at last." Lavinia smiled perfectly, politely. "I asked the gardener. I thought it was time." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple returned. "And quite unexpected, if I may say. Your cousin rarely spoke of her. He respected her deeply." Lavinia replied too quickly. "He simply had difficulty expressing it." Miss Marple let the silence stretch a moment longer than was comfortable. Sometimes silence is the loudest expression of all. Lavinia tucked her gloves more firmly into her handbag. "Indeed, but Horace was a private man, so I'm learning," Miss Marple said gently. She watched Lavinia smile as they parted. It was perfectly shaped, but sat strangely on her face, as though applied with care rather than feeling. Some smiles, she thought, are meant for others to see, not for the one wearing them. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a piece of mending untouched in her lap. Her thoughts, which she seldom claimed as clever, but which had the habit of being consistent, began arranging themselves. A registered letter to a solicitor, an anonymous donation for restoration, a polished headstone after years of neglect. She had known men like Horace Denbury before, rigid, controlled, morally certain. And she had also known the silence that follows them, the way people tiptoe around their legacies in hope of preserving a more palatable version. But what if Denbury had begun to feel the cracks? What if he had in the final days recognized the weight of a sister wronged, of a nephew disinherited, of a truth kept too long? Restitution in such men does not come with admission. It comes through arrangements, quiet ones, a letter, a gift, a gesture. She stirred. The cost of undoing a wrong is not always financial. Sometimes the price is carried by those still alive, those asked to live with what should have been said aloud, but never was. By the next morning, Miss Marple had settled into certainty, though not yet proof. She visited the vicar again, asking after the particulars of the donation. The phrase, "restoration of what has long been neglected," echoed in her mind. It was a legal turn of phrase, certainly, but it was also a confession, dressed in courtesy, wrapped in velvet phrases. That was how men like Denbury apologized, not with words, but with gestures passed through trusted hands. She stood again before Ellalinina's grave, noticed the cut violets, still fresh. Her grave tended not out of tradition, but out of penance. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them to the stillness of the churchyard. Yes, generosity often wears fine gloves, but guilt when unable to speak gives away more than it withholds. It appears in the absence of a name on a donation, in the polishing of stone, in the nervous smile of a cousin who knows that too many secrets have waited too long to remain buried. The pattern was forming, not yet finished, but enough to follow. It was the faint smell of smoke drifting across the green on Saturday morning that first unsettled the villagers. It came not from any hearth nor chimney, but from the fenced plot behind the disused schoolhouse. By the time Constable Burley reached the site, summoned by young Colin Fletcher on his bicycle, the fire had all but smoldered out. It had not spread, but had clearly been set with purpose. Papers, mostly blackened at the edges, some reduced to curling gray ribbons. Miss Marple, walking toward the post office at that very moment, paused. The scent of scorched paper hung low in the air, oddly familiar. She made no move to approach the schoolhouse, but watched as Burley emerged with a charred bundle wrapped in his coat. "There's a strange panic to destruction," she murmured to herself, "especially when something is too fragile to be left lying about, but too dangerous to be kept." She watched the constable with calm eyes, already sensing that something of value had been intended for erasure. But, as she well knew, even the best fires rarely destroy everything. By mid-afternoon, the constable had carefully separated the least damaged fragments on his desk at the station. Several sheets had burned straight through, but others remained legible in part. What remained bore a startling implication. Miss Marple, invited quietly by the vicar to hear the findings, listened without visible reaction. "The name Denbury appears more than once," Burley explained. and references to a will or a change to one, and something called a witness statement. Not all of it's clear, but he hesitated, lowering his voice. It mentions coercion, someone feeling obliged under pressure. There's a reference to the matter of the sister's intention being misrepresented. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That would make the fire timely. Burley sighed, pressing a soot-streaked edge of paper with the back of a spoon. Someone wanted this gone, and now it nearly is. Miss Marple studied the charred edges, but not quite. Secrets, Constable, are rarely so willing to disappear. They leave residue in paper, in rooms, in people, and in silence, she thought. Most of all, the following morning brought news that unsettled even those inclined to skepticism. Mr. Daniel Bryce had been arrested. The charge was vague. Suspicion of arson, the constable said, and potentially interfering with evidence tied to the Denbury estate. No one said it aloud, but the implication was clear. He had something to hide, and something to gain. Miss Marple heard of the arrest from the postmistress, who related with the hushed relish reserved for grave tidings. Mr. Bryce had not protested, only looked bewildered, and according to Colin Fletcher, very quiet, like he didn't know where he was. She walked to the constable's station after lunch. He greeted her with a furrowed brow. We had to, Miss Marple. There were traces of ash on his boots, and someone saw him near the schoolhouse on Friday. And who saw him? She asked gently. Burley hesitated. Linnea Denbury said she glimpsed him from the orchard. Miss Marple inclined her head. Then I imagine she will be quite relieved the matter is settled. But her voice, though soft, carried the distinct note of a woman who had not yet seen all the cards laid down. Sunday service began in usual solemnity. The bells rang out. The villagers arrived in pressed suits and gloved hands, and the pews filled slowly. Lavinia Denbury entered just before the third hymn, her expression composed but pale beneath her navy hat. It was during the sermon that the incident occurred. A soft noise, cloth brushing wood, then a sudden motion. Lavinia had slumped forward, her handbag tumbling to the floor. The vicar broke off mid-sentence as Mrs. Ridgewell cried out. Dr. Humbleton was summoned and declared it a fainting spell, perhaps brought on by shock, but his voice held unease, and a bottle of sleeping tablets was later found in her handbag, half emptied. No note, no final word, just a quiet fall, a brief silence, and then the inevitable murmuring. Miss Marple, seated further back, watched the scene with a stillness more reflective than alarmed. Collapses in churches, she knew, were often more about the weight of secrets than sickness. And Lavinia, she thought, had been carrying quite a lot, for quite some time. By the time Evenong approached, the village was already adrift in speculation. Miss Hartnell told 3 people it was grief. Mrs. Finch was certain it was guilt. Mr. Pilcher ventured that it might be fear, the quiet sort, the kind that settles under your ribs and stays there. The whispers drifted between the font and the aisle like incense after High Mass. No one dared say exactly what they suspected, but the scent of scandal had already settled over the wooden pews and brass hymn numbers. Miss Marple, taking her place beside the vicar's wife for the evening service, listened without joining. She had long ago discovered that those who whispered most eagerly were often furthest from the truth. Still, the shape of things was changing. Daniel Bryce in a cell, Lavinia in a hospital bed, Horace Denbury in his grave, and the truth is yet still moving unseen beneath them all. After the final prayer, Miss Marple lingered in the vest under the pretext of returning a borrowed devotional. The vicar, removing his stole with quiet gravity, offered her tea in the adjoining room. They sat by the fire as the evening fell blue across the panes. Neither spoke for a moment. She tried to end it. The vicar said at last, "Whatever it was." Miss Marple nodded, hands folded lightly on her lap. People rarely attempt such a thing over one sorrow alone. It's often a tangle of them, knotted by time, guilt, and the dread of what may finally be spoken. The vicar looked at her with weary kindness. We carry our sins quietly in this parish. Some keep them folded in drawers, others pressed into their hymnals, and some, he hesitated, some attempt to burn them. But fire, said Miss Marple, rarely cleanses. It only disfigures. She rose, setting her cup aside. Truth doesn't vanish, vicer. It waits. It lingers. As she left the vicerage, the bells above the tower gave a slow chime, not a warning nor a benediction, just a reminder that time was passing, and soon all things would be revealed. Miss Marple arrived at the offices of Halcombe and Blythe under the pretense of a modest, but necessary task to review the arrangements for her own affairs. "One never knows," she remarked lightly to Miss Blee, the solicitor's daughter and secretary, "and I always feel a tidy drawer gives one peace of mind." She was ushered in with the gentle deference owed to a woman of her age and social standing. While Mr. Halcombe leafed through her modest file, she turned her attention to the ledgers and account books stacked neatly on the side desk. A ledger had been left open, clearly unrelated to her visit, but forgotten in the casual way. Busy professionals often overlook small order. Miss Marple's glance lingered, just long enough to observe 2 pages. One marked estate of H. Denbury, and another curious in its brevity, showing only a single transaction with no explanation. A substantial cash withdrawal 3 days before Mr. Denbury's death. When she returned her gaze to Hal, her manner was as pleasant as ever. "It's such a comfort," she said, "to know one's final requests will be managed by people who value precision." Halcombe smiled obligingly, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained elsewhere. It was never the records themselves that revealed truth, but the gaps they left behind. That evening she sat with her small ledger at home, making notes under the glow of a shaded lamp. It was not the amount that troubled her, though it was considerable, but the absence of any linked expenditure, transaction, or estate planning to justify its removal. Horace Denbury had been many things, but he had never been careless with detail. Even the village fate accounts on which he once consulted bore his faint penciled adjustments in the margins. To remove such a sum without designation, no notation, no instruction, no attached document, was not like him. Unless, she thought, it had not been a legal act at all, not a part of an estate, but an act of conscience, quiet, private, deliberately undocumented. She returned her pen to its inkwell and looked at the faint scratch of light beneath her front door. The world was full of shadows that moved just beyond where others looked. But Miss Marple had always been rather good at watching where others did not. 2 days later, Miss Marple stepped into the village branch of Midlands and County Bank under the usual pretext, inquiring after a misposted dividend check. Mr. Knowles, the junior clerk, greeted her with his usual nervous courtesy. As they discussed the particulars of her account, Miss Marple inquired, as if idly, whether Mr. Denbury's business had been left in good order. Mr. Knowles, young and precise, nodded eagerly, mostly, though there was that new account he opened. Strange thing that. Miss Marple tilted her head. A new account. Yes, just last week. Sole signatory, of course, but under a different name. J.T. Bryce. She smiled lightly. How very modern of him. And was the address local? No, miss. Actually, it was blank. Left that field entirely untouched. Miss Marple made a soft sound, the kind that could be agreement or sympathy, and he deposited a sum. Mr. Knowles checked his records. No deposit, just transferred from one of his older holdings. Then nothing else. And of course, well, he passed before anything more came of it. I see, she said. Thank you, Mr. Knowles. You've always been most helpful. She stepped out into the sunlight with her gloves folded gently in one hand. J.T. Bryce, her name lifted from a grave, placed neatly into a ledger. A ghost now kept alive by numbers. That evening in her parlor, Miss Marple reviewed the shape of it. The money was not meant for Daniel, at least not in the usual sense. No, it had been placed in a name long gone, a brother dead in war, a memory preserved in black and white on a mantelpiece. Horace Denbury, exacting to the last, had created an account that could not be legally claimed, an account whose existence could only make sense to someone who understood what guilt sounded like when left too long unsaid. It was not generosity. Not quite. It was something else. An act too strange to be public, too bound in the past to be practical. She wondered what the plan had been. A letter to follow, a confession sealed and never sent, or perhaps simply a quiet signal, a final nod to a life overlooked. Men like Denbury, Miss Marple thought, do not apologize, but they sometimes try to rearrange the room before they leave it. On Wednesday, she returned to Weaver's cottage with a modest tin of honey biscuits. Daniel Bryce received her with the same subdued grace, though the circles beneath his eyes had deepened. "I was released on account of insufficient evidence," he said quietly before she asked. "The fire. I didn't start it. I know who they think I am." Miss Marple said nothing at first. She placed the tin on the table and let her eyes rest on the photograph of the uniformed young man on the mantel. "Did you serve with your brother?" she asked gently. Bryce nodded. "Same unit. He was better than I was. Quicker, braver. He took the blast. I took the years." "And the field hospital?" A pause. "Then 2 weeks. I was kept in a tent, hallucinating more than speaking. There was a nurse, kind. I never saw her after." "Did she have a northern accent?" Miss Marple asked softly, her hesitation when pronouncing vowels. Bryce looked at her startled. "Yes. How did you know?" Miss Marple's expression did not change. Sometimes the past arrives again, but under another name. He poured the tea without a word, then sat. "It was her," he said at last. "Lavinia. She was different then. She told me once while I was barely coherent that not all things broke, and stay that way. She used another name. Harris, I think." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "She nursed you, and then returned to her life, quietly, without ever speaking of it. I didn't remember her until recently when I moved here. She recognized me before I recognized her. I think she thought I wouldn't. She thought she owed you something," Miss Marple said gently, "and she was afraid that if the truth of Horace's dealings came to light, your name would be dragged through it. So she stepped forward first, and when the burden of silence became too heavy, she collapsed under it." Bryce stared at the table. "I never asked her to do any of it. People rarely do," Miss Marple said, "but debts of the heart are paid in stranger currency than checks." She stood slowly. Outside the wind stirred the hedges. The village was still, but inside one more knot had quietly come undone. It was a gray afternoon, the sort that softened the outlines of chimneys and hedges alike. In the parlor of the vicarage, beneath the faded ceiling rose and framed scripture verses, for people sat in calm expectation. Miss Marple, with her usual shawl neatly folded over her shoulders, presided without presiding. Lavinia Denbury sat near the fire, her posture upright, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Daniel Bryce, freshly released and bearing the slightly lost expression of one in used to company, kept to a corner of the city. Constable Burley occupied the nearest upright chair, his cap resting in his lap. The vicar stood at the window, arms loosely crossed, silent. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Thank you for coming," she said, her tone gentle but assured. "I thought it time we gathered, not to accuse nor to judge, but to understand, and perhaps in understanding we may at last make peace with what has already come to pass." No one spoke, but the silence now felt expectant rather than defensive. It was not the sort of silence that holds fear, but the kind that waits for something long delayed. She began, not with a statement of fact, but with the quiet unfurling of a truth long woven into whispers. "And now, finally, ready to be named. Mr. Denbury," Miss Marple began, "was not a man prone to change. That much, I believe we all understood. He valued control, order, and above all, appearance. But in the last week of his life, something altered." She paused, her gaze resting briefly on Lavinia. "He sent a registered letter to a solicitor in London. He created a bank account under a name that no longer belonged to any living man. He cleaned a grave, long neglected, and most curiously of all, he donated a considerable sum to the church anonymously." The vicar turned slightly, startled. Lavinia's lips parted, but she said nothing. "These were not random acts," Miss Marple continued. "They were the acts of a man preparing to make amends. I believe Mr. Denbury was taking steps to restore what he had once quietly and deliberately taken from his sister's heirs. That is, to undo the injustice of a will he had manipulated." Constable Burley looked down at his hands. "He never filed anything official." "No," said Miss Marple. "He had not yet reached that part, but he had begun. And as with many things in life, he began just too late." Miss Marple looked now to Lavinia. You confronted him, did you not? Perhaps you had seen the letter or overheard something. Or perhaps he told you himself, speaking not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one afraid of exposure. Lavinia's knuckles whitened. She looked towards a fire. You feared what might come to light, Miss Marple said, her voice still soft. Not only about the will, but about yourself. Your time as a nurse, your secret act of kindness. You feared what it might look like. Your connection to Mr. Bryce, your presence at the estate, your name whispered again in parish talk. I didn't intend. Lavinia started, then stopped. No, Miss Marple agreed. You didn't intend harm. You intended to warn him, but he would not be warned. And in the quarrel, I believe he turned to walk away, and you reached for him, perhaps to stop him speaking, perhaps simply to restrain him. There was no accusation in her tone, only calm observation. But you pushed him, not with violence, no, but in fear, and he fell. Lavinia turned her face away. He stumbled, she whispered. I only meant to make him stop. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle once more before she spoke again. And Mr. Bryce, she said, turning gently to him, was given not one but two alibis, one by way of the card game at the Black Bull, and the other by Lavinia, who claimed to have seen a man matching his description near the footbridge. Daniel frowned, his confusion genuine. But I didn't ask. No, Miss Marple agreed. You didn't. They were given to you because you were seen as someone too fragile to bear suspicion, because there were those who felt you had suffered enough, and because perhaps the truth would have been too heavy for you to carry too. The constable shifted. He didn't even know, he said slowly, that someone was protecting him. Indeed, Miss Marple nodded, which makes it no less protection and no less dangerous. Sometimes the desire to protect leads to more harm than the truth ever could. Daniel lowered his head. I didn't know what was happening, he said quietly. I just wanted to be left in peace. Miss Marple looked at him with great kindness. Peace, she said, is never built on silence. Lavinia's voice broke the hush. I was afraid, she said, her voice thin but clear. Not of the law, of the shame, of what people would say, of what they would imagine if they knew I had hidden things, helped someone, held back the truth. She turned to Daniel. I remembered you, and I was proud once that I had done something that mattered. But I thought if anyone knew, they'd think there was something improper, that I had protected you for reasons I couldn't explain, that I wanted something from you. I didn't. Daniel said nothing, but his hands gripped his knees tightly. I saw the papers, she continued. I knew Horace was planning something. He had the solicitor's reply in his desk. He said he would make things right, but only on his own terms. I said he couldn't, that he didn't deserve to decide what forgiveness looked like. He laughed, said I was sentimental, said everything could be cleared up neatly. Once the documents were signed, Miss Marble's voice, when it came, was soft. And nothing ever is, Miss Denbury. Not neatly. Not really. Lavinia's eyes filled with quiet resignation. No, she said. I know that now. The fire crackled gently as Miss Marple rose and smoothed the folds of her skirt. The others remained seated, not as accused, but as witnesses of a quiet unraveling and a truth long overdue. Some truths, she said, arrive like guests long forgotten, awkward, unexpected, yet impossible to turn away. She turned to the vicar. You have always said that sin weighs differently on each heart, but shame, I think, weighs precisely the same, whether deserved or not. She moved to the window. Outside, the church bell gave a single chime. This room has not changed, she said. The furniture is arranged as it was when I first visited some 20 years ago. But nothing here is quite the same. Not now, because understanding has entered the room, and with it the uncomfortable rearrangement of what we thought we knew. No one replied, but something had shifted. A subtle relief, a loosening of something tightly wound. Miss Marple looked back at them, her expression thoughtful, not triumphant. One cannot tidy up truth like a sitting room, she said gently. It remains as it was. However, one repositions the chairs. And with that, she took her shawl and left, the light from the window tracing her path to the door. In the days that followed, life in St. Anselm's Hollow returned to its usual patterns, or at least appeared to. The sun broke through the mist with greater confidence, and the hedgerows burst into blossom with the kind of insistence only English spring can achieve. In Miss Marple's garden, the Queen of Sweden roses had recovered their blush, and the early pays were beginning to yawn open. She moved among them with quiet purpose, trimming where needed, encouraging where she could. The soil was warming beneath her gloves, and the birds had resumed their squabbles over nesting rights in the sycamores beyond the lane. Nature, she reflected, has its own form of forgetfulness. It covers, it grows, it blooms again, but it does not truly forget. The roots remember, the branches keep their shape, just as people do, even when they pretend otherwise. That Sunday, Miss Marple took tea with the vicar under the apple tree behind the rectory. The wind was soft and carried the faint scent of chamomile from the garden border. The vicar poured with a steady hand, though his brow still wore the thoughtful furrows of a man not yet settled in his conscience. "I still cannot decide," he said at length, "whether justice was served. There was no trial, no confession, only understanding." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Justice," she replied, "is not always best served in courtrooms. Sometimes it is best left to the people who carry it, and carry it they do." He looked at her puzzled. "Lavinia will carry the truth," she said gently, "and so will Daniel. But so much of what we call lies, vice, are not born of wickedness. They are born of love or fear or the wish to delay pain." He nodded. "And what of truth?" She smiled faintly. "Truth arrives when it is no longer needed for punishment, but when it is most needed for peace." By the following week, Daniel Bryce had left the village. No one remarked on it aloud, though Mrs. Ridgewell noted that the curtains at Weaver's cottage had not been drawn for 2 mornings. His departure was neither celebrated nor mourned, merely absorbed into the quiet rhythm of things. Lavinia was not mentioned again. Her name, once spoken with such frequency, slipped into the gentle exile of village silence, the kind reserved for those whose presence makes others uncertain where to place their sympathy. But Miss Marple, walking her usual path past the churchyard, paused again by Ellalinina Denbury's grave. The violets had faded. The stone was damp from spring rain. She stood a moment longer than she had before. In her memory, the image of a broken walking stick and a stopped silver watch remained, not as evidence, but as emblems of a man who tried too late to realign a crooked past. And some part of her, the part that believed in small justices and quiet reckonings, thought he might have succeeded just enough. Sometimes the truth arrives not with drama, but with a teacup set gently on a saucer and the quiet voice of someone who's been watching all along. In St. Anselm's Hollow, justice didn't come from a courtroom or a confession, but through a series of silences, each one gently unraveled by Miss Marple. A man tried to make amends too late. A woman let her guilt bloom in secrecy. And another bore suspicion he never invited simply because he'd once survived what others couldn't understand. But isn't that often the way with human nature? We tell ourselves that protecting someone means hiding things. That silence is safer than shame. And yet, as Miss Marple reminded us, truth is not something you can tidy up like a drawing room. It remains, however. You reposition the chairs. So, now here's the question I'd love to leave you with. If you were in Lavinia's place, carrying a secret, fearing the scandal, would you have told the truth from the beginning? Or would you, like her, have waited too long?